The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps as Maria Santos pulled her wool sweater tighter around her shoulders, the fabric rough against skin that hadn't known true warmth in months. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in downtown Phoenix stretched before her like a maze of beige walls and flickering overhead bulbs, each corridor identical to the last, each turn leading deeper into a bureaucratic labyrinth that seemed designed to exhaust hope before it could take root. "Maria Santos?" The voice cut through the ambient noise of rolling gurneys and muffled conversations. A woman in pale blue scrubs stood beside a clipboard, her expression professionally neutral in that particular way that hospital staff perfected, caring enough to avoid lawsuits, distant enough to avoid emotional investment. Maria rose from the plastic chair that had been molding itself to her hip bones for the past 2 hours. The movement sent a familiar spike of electricity down her left side, a reminder that her body carried more than memories from her 3 tours in Afghanistan. The shrapnel fragments embedded along her spine weren't just medical curiosities listed in her file. They were pieces of a roadside bomb that had torn through her unit's convoy on a dusty morning outside Kandahar, fragments of metal that had traveled from an insurgent's workshop into the most intimate spaces of her nervous system. "Room 7B, the nurse continued, already moving toward the next name on her list. "Dr. Castellanos will be with you shortly. You'll need to change into a gown." The walk down the corridor felt longer than the patrols she'd once led through hostile territory. Here, the enemy was different, not hidden behind rubble and doorways, but embedded in forms and procedures, in the casual dismissal that came with being just another file number in an overwhelmed system. Maria's combat boots, the same ones she'd worn through her final deployment, squeaked against the polished linoleum with each step. She'd kept wearing them not out of nostalgia, but because they were the only shoes that provided enough support for her damaged back, the only footwear that didn't send shooting pains up through her legs during the long waits that had become the defining characteristic of her civilian life. Room 7B was smaller than a jail cell, painted in that particular shade of institutional green that seemed designed to make people feel sick even when they weren't. A paper-covered examination table dominated the space, flanked by outdated medical equipment and a computer terminal that looked like it had been salvaged from the 1990s. On the wall hung a poster showing the human spine in cross-section, each vertebra labeled with clinical precision that somehow managed to strip away the reality of what those bones meant when they were cracked and fused and held together by titanium screws and stubborn will. Maria had been through this routine more times than she could count over the past 18 months. Strip down, put on the gown that never quite closed in the back, answer the same questions about pain levels and mobility that she'd answered dozens of times before. The doctors would poke and prod, order the same tests that had been ordered before, and eventually conclude that yes, she was disabled, but not disabled enough to qualify for the benefits that might allow her to afford an apartment with heat, or groceries that weren't purchased with carefully rationed food stamps. But today felt different. Today there was something in the nurse's tone, something in the way she'd avoided eye contact, that suggested this examination would deviate from the usual script. Dr. Castellanos entered without knocking, a habit that Maria had noticed was universal among VA physicians. He was younger than she'd expected, probably fresh out of residency and assigned to the VA as part of some loan forgiveness program. His white coat was pristine, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a badge of authority he was still learning to wear. Behind him came 2 other figures, a woman in administrative clothing carrying a tablet, and a man in a security uniform whose presence immediately shifted the energy in the room from medical to adversarial. "Miss Santos," Dr. Castellanos began, consulting his tablet rather than looking at her directly, "we need to conduct a comprehensive disability evaluation today. There have been some questions raised about the extent of your injuries." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and threatening. Maria had learned to read between the lines of bureaucratic language during her years of navigating the VA system. Questions raised meant someone, somewhere, had decided that her disability claims might be fraudulent. It meant that, despite the medical records, despite the X-rays and MRIs and surgical reports, someone believed she might be lying about the pieces of metal that had made a permanent home in her spine. "What kind of questions?" Maria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The administrator stepped forward, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who had delivered bad news so often it had become routine. "There have been reports that you've been seen engaging in activities inconsistent with your claimed level of disability. Someone observed you lifting heavy objects, walking without apparent difficulty. We need to verify the current state of your condition." Maria felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the same surge of adrenaline that had once helped her survive firefights but now only served to make her appear defensive in situations where calm compliance was the only acceptable response. She thought of Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor, whose water heater had broken the previous week. Maria had helped move the old unit to the curb, knowing it would mean 3 days of increased pain because Mrs. Chen had no one else to ask. She thought of the times she'd forced herself to walk normally through the grocery store, not wanting to attract the stares and whispered comments that came with visible disability, pushing through the pain because sometimes dignity required a performance of normalcy. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "I understand," Maria said finally, though understanding and accepting were different things entirely. Dr. Castellanos set down his tablet and pulled on latex gloves with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this routine countless times. "We'll need you to disrobe completely. This needs to be a thorough examination. We need to document the location and extent of any scarring, check for signs of recent surgery or medical devices that might not be in your file." The request should have been routine. Maria had been examined by dozens of doctors over the past year and a half, had grown accustomed to the clinical detachment with which medical professionals viewed the human body. But something about this situation felt different. The presence of the security guard, the administrator with her tablet ready to document everything, the way Dr. Castellanos avoided meeting her eyes. "Can I get some privacy while I change?" Maria asked. The administrator shook her head. "I'm afraid not. Given the nature of this evaluation, we need to ensure the integrity of the examination process." Maria's hands moved to the hem of her sweater, then stopped. In Afghanistan, she had showered in communal facilities, had changed clothes in tents shared with a dozen other soldiers, had learned to treat her body as a functional tool rather than something private or sacred. But this was different. This was being forced to strip naked in front of strangers who suspected her of lying about her pain, who viewed her body not as the vessel that had carried her through 3 combat deployments, but as potential evidence of fraud. The sweater came off first, revealing the scar tissue that crisscrossed her left shoulder like a roadmap of violence. Then her jeans, each movement sending familiar spikes of discomfort up her spine. The sports bra and underwear were last, leaving her standing naked under the harsh fluorescent lights, while 3 strangers examined her like a specimen. Dr. Castellanos began his examination methodically, starting with her shoulders and working his way down. He documented each scar, each area of limited mobility, dictating notes to the administrator who typed everything into her tablet. When he reached the small of her back, his fingers probed along her spine with clinical precision, feeling for the hardware that held her vertebrae together. "Can you feel this?" he asked, pressing against a spot just below her shoulder blade. "No," Maria answered honestly. The nerve damage in that area was extensive. She could see him touching her, but the sensation might as well have been happening to someone else's body. He moved lower, his examination growing more thorough. Maria stared at a spot on the wall where the paint had begun to peel, focusing on the irregular pattern of the damage rather than the humiliation of standing naked while being evaluated like livestock. She had endured worse things: interrogations, enemy fire, the surgical procedures that had put her back together after the bomb, but those had been necessary evils, part of war or healing. This felt like punishment for the crime of needing help. Dr. Castellanos' fingers stopped moving. Maria heard his sharp intake of breath, saw him lean closer to examine something he'd discovered. The room fell silent except for the persistent hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the hospital beyond the closed door. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his professional composure cracking for the first time. The administrator looked up from her tablet. "Doctor?" Dr. Castellanos straightened slowly, his face pale beneath the harsh lighting. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality. Not the bored efficiency of routine examination, but something approaching awe mixed with horror. "There's shrapnel embedded directly in her spinal column. Multiple fragments, I can feel them through the skin." He paused, consulting her file with new attention. According to this, she was injured in an IED explosion, sniper division. The security guard, who had been standing silently by the door, shifted uncomfortably. The administrator's fingers froze over her tablet screen. "What's her unit designation?" Dr. Castellanos asked, scrolling through the digital file. "1st Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, Scout Sniper Team," the administrator read. 3 combat deployments. Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device, Combat Action Badge. The silence that followed was different from the clinical quiet of moments before. This was the silence of recognition, of understanding that they had been treating not just another disability claimant, but someone whose body carried the literal fragments of war, whose scars were not just medical conditions but evidence of service that had cost her pieces of herself. Dr. Castellanos pulled off his gloves and handed Maria the hospital gown with a gentleness that hadn't been present before. "You can get dressed," he said quietly. "I've seen enough." But Maria remained still, the gown clutched against her chest, her eyes fixed on the 3 people who had just shifted from skeptics to something approaching believers. The moment stretched out, fragile and uncertain, balanced on the edge of an understanding that hadn't existed minutes before. "The fragments," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface, "they're still moving. The doctors said they would work their way out eventually, or migrate deeper. They can't remove them all without risking paralysis. So I live with them, every day, every step, every breath." Dr. Castellanos nodded, his eyes now meeting hers directly. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried weight that went beyond the clinical. "For what?" Maria asked, though she knew the answer. "For doubting you, for making you prove what should have been trusted from the beginning." Maria began to dress slowly, each movement deliberate and careful, the sports bra first, then the jeans that had grown looser over the months. As chronic pain had affected her appetite, the sweater last, pulled down to cover the scars that told a story she was tired of having to explain. As she finished dressing, the administrator closed her tablet with a decisive snap. "I'll need to file an amended report," she said, though she was addressing Dr. Castellanos rather than Maria. "This changes the evaluation significantly." "Yes," the doctor agreed, "it does." Maria laced up her combat boots, the familiar ritual providing a small measure of comfort in the sterile room. When she stood, the movement sent the expected jolt of pain through her back. Not unbearable, but constant, a reminder that her body would never again be the efficient machine it had once been. "What happens now?" she asked. Dr. Castellanos was making notes in her file, his handwriting more careful than it had been at the beginning of the appointment. "Now we process your claim properly, with the respect it should have received from the beginning." But even as he spoke, Maria could see the questions in his eyes. The same questions that had followed her since she'd returned from her final deployment. How many others were there? How many other veterans had been forced to strip naked to prove their pain was real? How many had been turned away because their injuries weren't visible enough, dramatic enough, credible enough to satisfy bureaucrats who had never heard the whistle of incoming mortars or felt the ground shake from an IED explosion? The security guard opened the door, his presence now seeming unnecessary and vaguely embarrassing. As Maria walked past him into the corridor, she heard Dr. Castellanos speaking to the administrator in low tones, their conversation urgent and private. She didn't stop to listen. She had heard enough bureaucratic discussions about her case to last several lifetimes. The walk back through the maze of corridors felt different now. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, the beige walls still stretched endlessly in all directions, but Maria carried herself differently. Not because the pain had diminished, if anything, the stress of the examination had increased her discomfort, but because, for the first time in months, someone had seen her scars and understood what they represented. In the waiting area, other veterans sat in the same plastic chairs Maria had occupied hours earlier. An older man with a cane leaned against the wall, his face patient with the particular exhaustion that came from fighting battles with paperwork instead of enemies. A woman about Maria's age stared at her phone, her left arm held at an awkward angle that suggested nerve damage or joint problems. A young man who couldn't have been more than 25 sat alone in a corner, his eyes fixed on nothing, his body perfectly still in the way that spoke of invisible wounds that ran deeper than shrapnel. Maria paused at the reception desk to schedule her follow-up appointment, the same routine she'd performed dozens of times before. But as she wrote her name in the appointment book, she found herself wondering about the stories carried by every other veteran in the waiting room. How many of them had been questioned, doubted, forced to prove their pain was real? How many carried fragments of war in their bodies, their minds, their spirits, only to be met with suspicion when they asked for help? The receptionist handed her an appointment card for the following month. "Dr. Castellanos wants to see you again in 4 weeks," she said. "He's putting a rush on your file review." Maria nodded and slipped the card into her wallet, next to her expired military ID and the small photo of her unit that she still carried everywhere. As she walked toward the exit, she could feel the familiar sensation of the shrapnel shifting slightly with each step, the metal fragments that had become part of her anatomy responding to movement and pressure in ways that medical textbooks could describe but never fully capture. Outside, the Arizona sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of sunsets over Afghan mountains. The parking lot stretched before her, filled with cars bearing various military and veteran organization bumper stickers, small declarations of service in a world that often seemed to have forgotten what that service meant. Maria's truck was parked in the back row, the same beat-up Ford she'd bought with her separation pay. The engine took 3 tries to turn over, a mechanical reminder that everything in her life, from her body to her vehicle, required more effort than it once had. As she waited for the engine to warm up, she looked back at the VA Medical Center, its windows glowing with the same fluorescent light that had illuminated her examination. Tomorrow she would wake up with the same pain, the same financial struggles, the same uncertainty about whether her disability claim would provide enough support to keep her housed and fed. But tonight, for the first time in months, she would go to sleep knowing that someone had seen her scars and understood their meaning. Someone had touched the fragments of war embedded in her spine and recognized them for what they were, not evidence of weakness or fraud, but proof of service that had cost her pieces of herself that could never be replaced. As she pulled out of the parking lot, Maria caught a glimpse of Dr. Castellanos through one of the windows, still in his white coat, still working under the harsh lights. She wondered what he would do with what he'd learned today, whether her case would change how he approached other veterans who came through his examination room. She wondered if he would remember her name when he encountered the next skeptical administrator, the next security guard brought in to witness a veteran's humiliation. The drive home took her through neighborhoods where American flags hung from front porches and yellow ribbon magnets on cars declared support for the troops. But Maria had learned the difference between symbolic support and the practical reality of caring for those who had served. The flags and ribbons were easy. They cost nothing and required no sacrifice from those who displayed them. The harder work, the medical care, the disability benefits, the recognition that some wounds never fully heal, that required something more than symbols. As she turned into the parking lot of her apartment complex, Maria felt the now familiar tightness in her back that came from sitting in one position too long. The shrapnel fragments shifted with the movement, sending small electric jolts through her nervous system like reminders that the war had followed her home and taken up permanent residence in her spine. But tonight, those fragments felt different somehow, not just like foreign objects that had invaded her body, but like evidence that would finally be believed. Like proof that her pain was real, her service was genuine, her need for help was legitimate. The apartment building's security light flickered as she climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit, her combat boots echoing off the concrete steps. Inside, the space was small and sparsely furnished, not from any aesthetic choice, but from the financial reality of living on temporary disability payments while fighting for permanent recognition of her service-connected injuries. Maria sat on her couch, the same piece of secondhand furniture she'd bought when she first moved to Phoenix, and slowly untied her boots. The familiar ritual of preparing for bed had become more complicated since her injury, each movement requiring calculation and care. But tonight, as she changed into pajamas and brushed her teeth, she found herself thinking not about the pain or the financial stress, but about Dr. Castellanos' face when he'd felt the shrapnel embedded in her spine. The moment of recognition, of understanding, of belief. It was a small victory in a war that seemed to have no clear end in sight. But sometimes, small victories were enough to keep fighting for another day. Maria's alarm clock buzzed at 0530 hours, the same time she'd awakened for 15 years of military service, The habit had persisted through her medical discharge, through months of rehabilitation, through the grinding bureaucracy of the VA system. Some routines were harder to break than others, and the discipline of an early start remained one of the few constants in a life that had been thoroughly disrupted by fragments of metal and the slow machinery of veteran services. She lay still for the first 10 minutes after waking, a practice she'd developed not from laziness but from necessity. The shrapnel in her spine required careful assessment each morning, determining which movements would be possible, which positions would trigger the shooting pains that could incapacitate her for hours. Today, like most days, there was a deep ache running from her left shoulder blade down to her hip, punctuated by sharp jolts when she shifted too quickly. The process of getting out of bed had become a tactical operation. Roll to the right side first, avoiding the area where the largest fragment pressed against her L3 vertebra. Swing legs over the edge, pause for the initial wave of pain to subside, then push up with her arms rather than relying on her back muscles. Stand slowly. Wait for the dizziness that sometimes accompanied the medication to clear, then take the first careful steps toward the bathroom. Maria's apartment was a study in adaptation. Grab bars installed next to the toilet, a shower chair that folded down from the wall, extra pillows strategically placed on every piece of furniture to provide lumbar support when sitting became necessary. The space bore little resemblance to the neat, functional quarters she'd maintained on base, where everything had its place and purpose. Here, purpose was defined by pain management and the constant negotiation between what she wanted to do and what her body would allow. The shower was both blessing and torment. The hot water helped loosen the perpetual tension in her muscles, but standing for extended periods sent lightning bolts down her legs. She'd learned to wash efficiently, shampooing and conditioning her hair on alternate days to minimize the time spent with her arms raised above her head. The soap she used was unscented. Strong fragrances had begun triggering headaches since her injury, another unexpected consequence of trauma that the medical textbooks hadn't prepared her for. Dressing required similar tactical thinking. Sports bras instead of traditional ones because she could no longer reach behind her back to fasten clasps. Slip-on shoes whenever possible, though her combat boots remained essential for days when she needed maximum support. Layers that could be added or removed as her body temperature fluctuated with pain levels and medication side effects. Breakfast was instant oatmeal with a banana, the same meal she'd eaten for the past 8 months. Not from lack of imagination, but because cooking required standing at the stove, reaching in the cabinets, bending to access lower shelves, all movements that accumulated into significant discomfort by the time she needed to face the day's challenges. The oatmeal was fortified with vitamins, a concession to the reality that her diet had become more about survival than nutrition. The kitchen window overlooked the apartment complex's courtyard, where other residents began their daily routines at more conventional hours. Maria watched Mrs. Rodriguez hanging laundry on the small patio of her ground-floor unit, moving with the careful precision of someone whose arthritis required its own accommodations. At the complex's far end, Marcus, a Gulf War veteran she'd befriended at a VA support group, loaded his wheelchair into a modified van, preparing for another day of battles with bureaucracy and medical appointments. The sight of Marcus always triggered conflicting emotions in Maria. His injuries were visible: the wheelchair, the missing left leg, the scars on his hands from the helicopter crash that had ended his military career. His disability was unquestionable, his need for assistance obvious to anyone who encountered him. Maria sometimes envied that clarity, the way his condition left no room for doubt or skepticism from administrators and medical professionals. Then she felt guilty for the envy, knowing that Marcus faced his own unique challenges, his own daily negotiations with a body that had been permanently altered by service to his country. The mail arrived at 0800 hours with military precision, delivered by a postal worker who'd been walking the same route for 15 years. Maria had learned to recognize the different envelopes that filled her mailbox. The thick packets from the VA that usually contained requests for additional documentation, the thin envelopes from medical providers that held appointment confirmations or test results, the occasional letter from old Army friends who'd scattered across the country after their enlistments ended. Today's mail included a letter from her brother in Colorado, the first personal correspondence she'd received in weeks. Diego had been asking her to move closer to his family, to let him help with the medical expenses and daily challenges she faced alone in Phoenix. The offer was generous and came from genuine love, But Maria struggled with the implications. Moving would mean admitting that she couldn't manage independently, that the woman who'd led sniper teams through hostile territory now needed her younger brother's assistance to navigate civilian life. She set the letter aside unopened, a habit she'd developed when facing decisions that felt too large for her current emotional capacity. The VA envelope contained a form requesting updated information about her pain levels, the same questions she'd answered in dozens of previous submissions. Rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Describe how your condition affects your daily activities. List any changes in your symptoms since your last evaluation. The questions were reasonable, but they reduced her experience to numbers and checkboxes, clinical language that couldn't capture the reality of waking up each morning uncertain whether she'd be able to walk to the bathroom without assistance. How do you quantify the moment when reaching for a coffee cup sends electricity through your nervous system? How do you rate the pain of watching your independence dissolve into a series of medical appointments and insurance claims? Maria filled out the form mechanically, her responses consistent with the dozens she'd submitted before. Pain level: 7 out of 10 on good days, 9 out of 10 on bad ones. Activities affected: walking, sitting, standing, lifting, reaching, sleeping. Changes in symptoms: increasing stiffness, occasional numbness in left leg, persistent muscle spasms in lower back. The truth was more complicated than the form allowed. Some days, distracted by a good book or an engaging conversation, she forgot about the shrapnel for minutes at a time. Other days, the pain was so consuming that she couldn't concentrate on simple tasks like reading the newspaper or following a television program. The medication helped, but it came with its own problems: drowsiness, digestive issues, the fog that settled over her thoughts and made complex reasoning difficult. She'd been a sniper, trained to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between her team's safety and disaster. Her mind had been sharp, focused, capable of calculating distance, wind speed, and trajectory while under enemy fire. Now, she sometimes struggled to remember whether she'd taken her morning medications or to follow the plot of a television show from beginning to end. The physical therapy appointment was scheduled for 1100 hours at a clinic across town. Maria allowed an extra 30 minutes for the drive, knowing that Phoenix traffic could be unpredictable and that rushing would increase her stress levels, which in turn increased her pain. The truck's air conditioning had been broken for 6 months, but repair costs were beyond her current budget. Summer in Arizona meant driving with windows down, arriving at appointments, sweaty and uncomfortable. The physical therapy clinic occupied the first floor of a medical complex that served primarily veterans and elderly patients. The waiting room held an familiar collection of people whose bodies bore evidence of lives that had demanded more than they could comfortably give. Maria recognized some faces from previous appointments. The Vietnam veteran with the prosthetic arm who always arrived exactly 15 minutes early. The middle-aged woman whose fibromyalgia left her moving with careful, measured steps. Maria Santos, the physical therapist, was a woman about her own age named Jennifer, whose patience and understanding had made the twice-weekly appointments tolerable rather than torturous. Jennifer had worked with combat veterans for 8 years, long enough to recognize the difference between physical pain and the deeper injuries that weren't visible on X-rays. The therapy session began with heat applied to Maria's lower back, followed by gentle stretching exercises designed to maintain what mobility remained in her damaged spine. Jennifer's hands were skilled at finding the places where muscles had tightened protectively around the shrapnel, where scar tissue had formed patterns that restricted movement and created new sources of discomfort. "How was your week?" Jennifer asked as she worked on releasing tension in Maria's left shoulder. "The VA exam happened," Maria replied, her voice muffled by the treatment table. "The one I told you about." "How did it go?" Maria was quiet for a moment, considering how to summarize the experience. "They made me strip naked to prove I wasn't lying about the shrapnel. Then the doctor felt it through my skin and suddenly believed everything in my file." Jennifer's hands paused in their movement. "I'm sorry that happened to you. It worked out in the end. I think my claim will finally get approved. But the process..." Maria trailed off, searching for words that could capture the humiliation without sounding self-pitying. "The process shouldn't require you to prove your pain is real," Jennifer finished. "Not when you have medical records documenting everything." "No, it shouldn't. But here we are." The conversation moved to safer topics, the exercises Maria could do at home, modifications to her daily routine that might reduce strain on her back, strategies for managing pain flare-ups. Jennifer never promised that things would get better, but she offered practical tools for making the current reality more manageable. In a world full of false hope and empty encouragement, her honesty was a gift. After therapy, Maria stopped at the grocery store, a weekly ordeal that required careful planning and strategic compromise. Shopping carts provided necessary support for walking through the store, but pushing them sent vibrations through her arms that traveled directly to her spine. She'd learned to shop during off-peak hours when the aisles were less crowded, allowing her to move slowly without blocking other customers. The grocery list was organized by store layout to minimize backtracking. Produce first, where she selected fruits and vegetables that required minimal preparation. Canned goods from shelves she could reach without stretching or bending. Frozen foods last, timed so they wouldn't thaw during the extended shopping process. Milk and bread from the dairy section, though she'd given up buying gallons of milk because their weight was too much for her to lift safely. At the checkout line, Maria watched the total climb on the register display, calculating in her head whether she had enough in her account to cover both groceries and the co-payment for her upcoming medical appointment. The temporary disability payments covered basic expenses, but left no margin for unexpected costs or small luxuries. She'd learned to find satisfaction in simple pleasures: a new magazine, a better brand of tea, the piece of fruit that wasn't on sale but looked particularly good. The bag boy was a teenager who moved with the casual strength of someone who'd never questioned his body's ability to perform basic tasks. He loaded her groceries into bags that would have been easy to carry 18 months ago, but now required careful distribution between both hands to avoid triggering muscle spasms. Maria thanked him with genuine appreciation for the assistance, remembering when such help would have seemed unnecessary or even patronizing. Back home, unpacking groceries became another tactical exercise, items that needed refrigeration first, while she still had the energy to bend and reach. Canned goods stored on lower shelves to avoid future problems. Anything heavy left on the counter until she could recruit help or figure out an alternative storage solution. The afternoon brought a phone call from the VA, a routine check-in that had become part of her weekly schedule. The caller was a caseworker named Patricia, whom Maria had never met face-to-face but who had become familiar through their regular conversations about claim status, appointment scheduling, and paperwork requirements. "I see Dr. Castellanos submitted an updated evaluation," Patricia said, her voice carrying a professionalism that couldn't quite mask genuine concern. "He's recommending approval for your claim at the 70% disability level." 70%. The number represented more than a mathematical calculation. It was validation that her injuries were real, recognition that her service had cost her capabilities she would never recover. More practically, it meant financial stability, access to better medical care, and the possibility of planning for a future that extended beyond the next month's rent payment. "What happens now?" Maria asked. "The evaluation goes to a review board. Given Dr. Castellanos' report and your service record, approval should be straightforward. You should hear something within the next 2 to 3 weeks." 2 to 3 weeks. Maria had been waiting 18 months for this resolution, but the final stretch felt longer than all the time that had preceded it. So much of her life had been on hold pending this decision: moving to a better apartment, considering job training programs that might allow her to work within her physical limitations, even simple things like buying a more reliable car or replacing worn-out clothes. After the call, Maria sat in her living room and looked around at the space she'd inhabited for the past year. The apartment was small and basic, but it had become home in ways she hadn't expected. She'd learned which floorboards creaked underfoot, which windows let in the most morning light, how the afternoon sun moved across the walls as the seasons changed. If the disability claim was approved, she could afford to stay here, to build something more permanent than the temporary arrangements that had defined her post-military life. The silence in the apartment was different from the silence she'd experienced in Afghanistan. There, quiet moments were filled with hypervigilance, awareness of threats that could materialize without warning. Here, silence was peaceful but also isolating. Maria had grown accustomed to solitude, but sometimes she missed the constant presence of her unit, the shared understanding that came from facing danger together. She'd tried joining veteran support groups, but found herself struggling to connect with other participants. Her injuries weren't visible like Marcus's, weren't as clearly defined as those of veterans with PTSD or traumatic brain injuries. She occupied a middle ground where her problems were serious enough to upend her life but not dramatic enough to elicit the immediate understanding and support that more obvious disabilities received. Evening brought the familiar ritual of preparing for another night's attempt at sleep. Medications taken on schedule, heating pad positioned to provide maximum relief for her back, pillows arranged to support her spine in the least painful configuration. The bedroom was kept deliberately cool. Heat seemed to increase the inflammation around the shrapnel sites, while cooler temperatures provided some measure of relief. Sleep had never come easily since her injury. The pain medication helped, but it also created a fog that made her feel disconnected from her own thoughts and experiences. She'd lie awake thinking about her unit, wondering where her former teammates were now, whether they'd successfully transitioned to civilian life, or if they were fighting their own battles with bureaucracy and broken bodies. Before the injury, Maria had been planning to make the Army a career. She'd been good at her job, respected by her peers, on track for promotion to the senior enlisted ranks where she could have mentored younger soldiers and shaped training protocols. The IED had ended those plans abruptly, leaving her to construct a new identity and purpose from the pieces that remained. The night sounds of the apartment complex were familiar by now. Mrs. Rodriguez's television playing Spanish-language programming, the upstairs neighbor's heavy footsteps, the occasional car engine starting as someone left for a late shift or returned from an evening out. These sounds had become comforting, evidence that she wasn't entirely alone in the world despite the isolation that her condition often imposed. As she finally began to drift towards sleep, Maria's thoughts returned to Dr. Castellanos and the moment when his examination had shifted from skeptical to understanding. The memory carried weight beyond the immediate practical implications for her disability claim. It represented a recognition that her invisible wounds were real, that her service had cost her something valuable and irreplaceable. Tomorrow would bring another day of managing pain, navigating bureaucracy, and adapting to limitations that 18 months earlier would have seemed impossible to accept. But tonight, for the first time in many months, Maria fell asleep feeling like someone had truly seen her. Not just her scars and medical records, but the person she had been before the shrapnel found its way into her spine, and the person she was becoming as she learned to live with its permanent presence. In her dreams, she was running again through mountain landscapes that looked like Afghanistan but felt like home. Her legs were strong, her back straight, her breathing easy. The weight of her rifle and equipment felt natural rather than impossible. When she woke, the contrast with reality would be jarring, but for these few hours of sleep, she was whole again. The approval letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same postal worker who'd been walking his route with clockwork precision for 15 years. Maria held the envelope for several minutes before opening it, her fingers tracing the official VA seal embossed on the heavy paper. When she finally tore it open, the words seemed to blur together. Approved. 70% service-connected disability. Monthly compensation effective immediately. She read the letter 3 times before the reality settled in. After 18 months of fighting, documenting, proving, and reproving her injuries, someone had finally acknowledged what she'd known all along. That the shrapnel in her spine was real, that her pain was legitimate, that her service had cost her pieces of herself that could never be replaced. But the victory felt hollow in ways Maria hadn't anticipated. The approval letter didn't erase the memory of standing naked in Dr. Castellanos' examination room while strangers questioned whether her wounds were genuine. It didn't undo the months of financial stress, the nights when she'd lain awake wondering if she'd become homeless because bureaucrats couldn't find her pain convincing enough. Most importantly, it didn't address the larger question that had been growing in her mind since that humiliating examination. How many other veterans were still fighting battles she'd just won? The first injustice revealed itself that afternoon when Marcus called with news that his own disability review had been scheduled. Despite his visible injuries, the missing leg, the wheelchair, the obvious daily struggles, the VA had decided to reevaluate his case after 8 years of approved benefits. "They're saying there's been advancement in prosthetic technology that might change my functional capacity," Marcus explained, his voice carrying a bitterness that Maria recognized from her own darkest moments. Like somehow a better fake leg is going to make my actual leg grow back. Maria sat in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with recognizing patterns of institutional cruelty. What kind of evaluation? Full medical exam, psychological assessment, functional capacity test. Marcus paused, and Maria could hear the sounds of traffic in the background. They want me to prove I'm still disabled. After 8 years. Like maybe I've been faking the whole wheelchair thing. The conversation continued for 40 minutes, Marcus sharing details that painted a picture of systematic skepticism toward veterans whose disabilities had been previously accepted and approved. His case wasn't isolated. Other members of their support group had received similar notifications, sudden demands to re-justify their need for assistance despite years of documented medical conditions. That evening, Maria attended her weekly support group meeting at the VA Community Center, a low-slung building on the outskirts of Phoenix that served veterans from across the metropolitan area. The meeting room was furnished with mismatched chairs arranged in a circle, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired, and walls decorated with motivational posters that seemed to mock the struggles discussed within. The group leader was Dr. Sarah Martinez, a clinical psychologist who had been working with veterans for 15 years. Her approach was practical rather than sentimental. She focused on coping strategies and resource navigation rather than empty encouragement about healing and moving forward. Tonight, the usual agenda was derailed by a series of stories that revealed a disturbing pattern. James, a Marine veteran with PTSD and traumatic brain injury, had been informed that his disability rating was under review because he'd been observed functioning normally at his daughter's soccer game. The observation report, filed by an investigator hired by the VA, noted that he'd been able to sit in bleachers for 2 hours and engage in conversation with other parents. "They followed me to my kid's game," James said, his voice shaking with anger. "Took pictures of me cheering for my daughter. Like somehow being a good father means my brain injury isn't real." Susan, a Navy veteran with fibromyalgia, had received a letter questioning her disability claim because she'd been seen carrying groceries to her car. The report didn't mention that she'd collapsed in her apartment afterward, unable to move for the rest of the day, or that the grocery trip had required 3 days of recovery. "I felt like a criminal," Susan said, "looking over my shoulder every time I left the house, wondering if someone was watching, waiting for me to do something that could be used against me." The stories accumulated throughout the evening, each one revealing new dimensions of a systematic campaign to question and reduce veteran disability benefits. Private investigators hired to surveil veterans during their daily activities. Medical evaluations conducted by doctors with no experience treating combat injuries. Administrative hearings where veterans were required to defend their pain levels to panels of bureaucrats who had never worn a uniform. Dr. Martinez listened to each story with professional composure, but Maria could see the strain in her expression. "What you're describing sounds like a coordinated effort to reduce disability payments," she said finally. "Has anyone contacted their congressional representatives? Filed complaints with the Inspector General's office?" The responses were variations on the same theme: bureaucratic runarounds, form letters acknowledging concerns without addressing them, staff members who seemed more interested in protecting the system than helping the veterans it was supposed to serve. After the meeting, Maria found herself walking to the parking lot with Robert Chen, a Vietnam veteran whose PTSD had been questioned after 45 years of documented treatment. Robert moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose medications affected his balance, his silver hair thinning but his bearing still carrying echoes of the Marine he'd once been. "My wife says I should let it go," Robert said as they reached his car, a sedan that had seen better decades but was meticulously maintained. "Says I'm too old to fight these battles anymore, but if I don't fight, who will?" The question haunted Maria during the drive home. At 32, she was younger than most veterans dealing with service-connected disabilities, but she'd already learned how exhausting it was to constantly defend her injuries to people who should have been helping her heal. What would it be like to fight the same battles for 45 years, to have your pain questioned by people who weren't born when you'd earned your wounds? The next morning brought a phone call from Jennifer, her physical therapist, with news that illustrated the breadth of the problem. The clinic was being pressured by insurance companies to reduce treatment sessions for veterans, based on new guidelines that suggested many were receiving more therapy than their conditions warranted. "They're saying chronic pain doesn't require ongoing treatment," Jennifer explained, her voice tight with professional frustration. Like somehow you're supposed to reach a point where the shrapnel in your spine stops being a problem. Maria's twice-weekly sessions would be reduced to once monthly, despite the fact that her condition required consistent management to prevent deterioration. The decision hadn't been made by doctors familiar with her case, but by administrators reviewing charts and making determinations based on cost reduction rather than medical need. "What about other patients?" Maria asked. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Everyone's being cut. Marcus is losing his sessions entirely. They're saying his prosthetic adjustment issues should be resolved by now. James can't get approval for the cognitive therapy that's been helping with his traumatic brain injury. Susan's pain management program has been discontinued because fibromyalgia is considered a, quote, subjective condition. The pattern was becoming clear. Veterans who had spent months or years fighting for recognition of their service-connected disabilities were now facing a second battle to maintain the care they'd already won. The system that had reluctantly approved their claims was now working to reduce or eliminate the benefits they'd been promised. That afternoon, Maria received a call from Patricia, her VA caseworker, with news that should have been good but carried ominous implications. Her disability rating had been confirmed at 70%, but she would be required to attend periodic reviews to ensure her condition hadn't improved. "How often?" Maria asked. "Every 6 months initially, then annually if your condition remains stable." The language was clinical, bureaucratic, designed to sound reasonable and necessary. But Maria understood the subtext. She would spend the rest of her life proving that her pain was real, that her disabilities were permanent, that she deserved the support she'd been promised. Every 6 months, she would face the possibility of having her benefits reduced or eliminated if her performance during a single examination didn't meet some undefined standard of authentic suffering. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Maria had been planning to use her approved benefits to pursue vocational training, to find work that could accommodate her physical limitations while providing purpose and additional income. Now the constant threat of reevaluation made long-term planning feel impossible. Why invest in training for a career when her income could be eliminated at any time based on a subjective medical assessment? The broader implications became clear during conversations with other veterans over the following days. The constant surveillance, the periodic reevaluations, the burden of repeatedly proving their disabilities. It all served to keep veterans in a state of perpetual anxiety and dependency. Instead of providing stable support that would allow them to rebuild their lives, the system created ongoing uncertainty that made healing and progress nearly impossible. Maria began researching the issue more systematically, spending hours online reading veteran advocacy websites, congressional testimonies, and investigative reports about disability claim processing. What she discovered was a carefully constructed system designed to appear supportive while actually discouraging veterans from seeking the help they'd earned. The statistics were staggering. Approval rates for initial disability claims had dropped by 40% over the past 5 years, not because veteran injuries had become less severe, but because the evaluation criteria had become more restrictive. Reevaluation rates had increased by 300% during the same period, with more than half resulting in reduced benefits regardless of whether the veteran's condition had actually improved. Private investigation firms had received millions of dollars in contracts to conduct surveillance of disabled veterans, creating an industry built around the assumption that veterans were lying about their injuries. The investigators were incentivized to find evidence of fraud or exaggeration, with bonuses paid for every case that resulted in reduced benefits. Most troubling were the training materials used by VA medical evaluators, which explicitly encouraged skepticism toward veteran claims and provided guidance on identifying inconsistencies that could justify denial or reduction of benefits. Veterans were expected to perform their disabilities consistently, to demonstrate pain and limitation in ways that satisfied evaluators who had never experienced combat injuries. The emotional toll of these discoveries was compounded by their timing. Just as Maria had begun to feel hopeful about her future, just as she'd started to believe that recognition of her service-connected disabilities might allow her to rebuild her life, she was confronted with evidence that the system designed to help her was actively working to undermine veterans like herself. The support group meetings became larger as word spread about the systematic challenges veterans were facing. Dr. Martinez had to move the meetings to a larger room, then to the building's main conference space, as dozens of veterans came forward with similar stories of surveillance, reevaluation, and benefits reduction. The stories shared during these meetings painted a picture of institutional gaslighting on a massive scale. Veterans were told their medical records were incomplete, their symptoms were inconsistent, their pain was subjective and therefore questionable. They were required to undergo evaluations by doctors who had never treated combat injuries, to defend their disabilities to panels that included no medical professionals, to prove their pain was real to people who approached their claims with presumptions of fraud. Maria found herself becoming an unofficial coordinator for the group's efforts to document and challenge these practices. Her military background had taught her systematic thinking and attention to detail, skills that proved valuable in organizing information and developing strategies for advocacy. But the work also required her to immerse herself daily in stories of injustice and betrayal that made her own struggles feel both validated and overwhelming. The breaking point came during a meeting where Linda Morrison, an Army veteran with severe PTSD and physical injuries from a convoy attack, broke down while describing her recent reevaluation experience. Linda had been receiving disability benefits for 3 years, when she was suddenly required to undergo a comprehensive review of her case. "They made me describe the attack in detail," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every sound, every smell, every moment of terror. They said they needed to verify that my memories were consistent with my previous statements, like I was supposed to have memorized my trauma word for word." The evaluation had lasted 8 hours, conducted by a panel that included no mental health professionals but did include an investigator who had questioned Linda about her activities outside her home. They'd noted that she occasionally went grocery shopping, that she'd attended her grandson's birthday party, that she'd been seen laughing during a conversation with a neighbor. "They said my ability to function in social situations was inconsistent with severe PTSD," Linda continued. "Like trauma means you're supposed to be completely incapacitated every moment of every day. Like having one good hour means all your bad hours don't count." Linda's benefits had been reduced from 100% to 30%, a decision that would force her to find employment despite panic attacks that made leaving her house a daily struggle. The reduction was based not on medical evidence but on behavioral observations that ignored the reality of how trauma affected different people in different ways. The room was silent after Linda finished speaking, the weight of her story settling over the group like a heavy blanket. Maria looked around at the faces of her fellow veterans, people who had served their country with honor, who had sacrificed their health and safety in defense of ideals they believed in, who now found themselves fighting a war against the very system that had promised to care for them. "This has to stop," Maria said finally, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "We can't keep accepting this treatment. We can't keep allowing them to question our pain, our service, our worth." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Around the circle, other veterans nodded, their expressions shifting from defeat to something approaching determination. The battle for recognition of their injuries had been won, but the war for dignity and respect was just beginning. Dr. Martinez closed the meeting with resources for filing complaints and contacting elected representatives. But Maria could see in her eyes the same realization that was dawning on everyone present. Individual complaints and form letters weren't going to address a problem this systematic and widespread. What was needed was a coordinated response, a unified voice that could challenge not just individual cases of mistreatment, but the entire culture of suspicion and denial that had infected the veteran services system. As the veterans filed out of the conference room, Maria found herself thinking about her sniper training, about the patience and precision required to identify targets and execute successful missions. The enemy now wasn't hidden behind rubble in a foreign country, but embedded in policies and procedures, protected by bureaucracy and justified by budget concerns. But the principles of engagement remained the same. Identify the target, plan the approach, execute with precision and determination. The war for veteran dignity was about to begin, and Maria Santos was ready to serve once more. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after Linda Morrison's devastating reevaluation, Maria received a phone call from someone who identified herself as Rebecca Torres, an investigative journalist with the Phoenix Tribune who had been researching veteran disability claims processing. "I understand you've been organizing support groups for veterans dealing with disability reevaluations," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the professional neutrality that Maria recognized from her own military briefings. "I've been investigating some concerning patterns in how these cases are being handled. Would you be willing to talk?" Maria agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, where they could speak privately without the institutional weight of the VA building looming over their conversation. Rebecca arrived precisely on time, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested years of asking difficult questions and demanding honest answers. "I've been working on this story for 6 months," Rebecca explained after they'd ordered coffee and found a quiet corner table. "Started when my own brother, a Marine veteran, had his PTSD benefits questioned after 12 years. The deeper I dig, the more systematic this appears to be." Rebecca spread a collection of documents across the table: internal VA memos, contractor agreements, budget analyses, and statistical reports that painted a devastating picture of institutional priorities. The documents revealed a coordinated effort to reduce veteran disability payments through increasingly aggressive evaluation standards and systematic surveillance programs. "This memo from last year," Rebecca said, pointing to a document marked with official letterhead, "directs regional offices to increase reevaluation rates by 40% and reduce approval rates for new claims by 35%. The stated goal is to achieve $2.8 billion in savings over 3 years. Maria studied the document, her military training allowing her to quickly parse the bureaucratic language and understand its implications. The memo didn't explicitly direct evaluators to deny legitimate claims, but it established quotas and incentives that made denial the path of least resistance. Regional offices that exceeded their savings targets would receive additional funding and administrative recognition. "Here's what really bothers me," Rebecca continued, producing another set of documents: the private investigation contracts. The VA is paying firms $1,200 per veteran to conduct surveillance, with bonus payments of $500 for every case that results in reduced benefits. They're literally incentivizing people to build cases against disabled veterans. The investigation reports made for disturbing reading. Veterans photographed while grocery shopping, their movements analyzed for signs of capabilities that might contradict their disability claims. Social media accounts monitored for evidence of activities that could be interpreted as inconsistent with reported limitations. Family members interviewed under the pretense of routine follow-up, their statements mined for information that could challenge the veteran's credibility. One report documented 3 months of surveillance on Robert Chen, the Vietnam veteran from Maria's support group. The investigator had photographed him walking his dog, noted the times he left his house, recorded conversations with neighbors about his garden. The report concluded that his apparent ability to maintain social relationships and engage in recreational activities was inconsistent with severe PTSD. "They're treating us like criminals," Maria said, her voice tight with anger, "like our service was a crime and our injuries are evidence we're trying to hide." Rebecca nodded, making notes in a reporter's notebook that looked like it had seen years of similar conversations. "The psychological evaluations are even worse. They're using standardized tests designed for insurance fraud detection, not trauma assessment. Veterans are being diagnosed as malingerers by psychologists who've never treated combat-related PTSD." The evidence continued to accumulate throughout their 2-hour conversation. Medical evaluators who were specifically trained to find inconsistencies in veteran claims, rather than to provide objective assessments. Administrative law judges with financial incentives to deny appeals. A systematic culture that viewed veteran disability claims as attempts at fraud rather than legitimate requests for earned benefits. "What can we do about it?" Maria asked finally. "Expose it," Rebecca said simply. "Shine enough light on these practices that they become politically untenable. But I need more than documents. I need veterans willing to go on the record with their stories, people willing to speak publicly about what they've experienced." Maria thought about the veterans in her support group, people who had already been traumatized by their service and then re-traumatized by the system designed to help them. Asking them to expose themselves publicly to risk further retaliation from the VA felt like another form of exploitation. "They're scared," Maria said. "Most of them depend on their benefits for basic survival. If they speak out and the VA retaliates..." "I understand the risk," Rebecca said. "But right now, the VA operates with impunity because they know veterans are isolated and afraid to speak up. If we can get enough people to tell their stories simultaneously, it becomes harder for them to retaliate against everyone. The conversation concluded with Rebecca providing Maria with her contact information and a secure communication method for sharing documents and coordinating with other veterans who might be willing to participate in the investigation. As Maria drove home, she felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders, the knowledge that decisions she made would affect the safety and welfare of people who trusted her judgment. The next support group meeting drew the largest crowd yet, nearly 40 veterans cramming into the conference room at the VA Community Center. Word had spread throughout the local veteran community about Maria's research and Rebecca's investigation, creating a sense that something important was finally happening after months of individual struggles and isolated defeats. Maria shared what she'd learned from Rebecca's documents, reading directly from internal memos and investigation reports. The room remained silent as the full scope of the systematic effort to deny veteran benefits became clear. When she finished, the silence stretched out for nearly a minute before Marcus spoke. "They're not trying to help us," he said, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "They're trying to get rid of us. Make us disappear so they don't have to deal with the cost of taking care of us." James raised his hand tentatively, the Marine veteran whose PTSD had been questioned after he was photographed at his daughter's soccer game. "What happens if we go public? What if they come after us harder?" The question hung in the air, representing the fear that kept many veterans silent despite the injustices they faced. Maria looked around the room at faces that reflected years of struggle with bureaucracy, pain, and financial uncertainty. These were people who had already sacrificed enormously for their country, who had given pieces of themselves that could never be recovered. Now they were being asked to risk what little security they had left. "I can't tell you there won't be consequences," Maria said finally, "but I can tell you what happens if we don't speak up. More veterans like Linda lose their benefits. More people like Robert get treated like criminals for having PTSD. More of us spend our lives proving that our pain is real to people who get paid for not believing us." Dr. Martinez had been listening from her usual position at the edge of the circle, her professional role requiring her to remain neutral in political discussions. But when Maria finished speaking, she leaned forward with an expression that suggested her neutrality had reached its limits. "From a clinical perspective," she said carefully, "what you're describing isn't just unfair treatment, it's systematic re-traumatization. We're asking veterans to repeatedly relive their worst experiences to justify receiving help, then questioning their credibility when they show signs of trauma. It's psychologically destructive by design." The discussion that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, with veterans sharing not just their own experiences, but their fears about speaking publicly. Some worried about retaliation from the VA, others about privacy concerns for their families. Several expressed guilt about potentially damaging public perception of veteran benefits programs that helped people who truly needed them. But gradually a consensus emerged around the idea that silence was no longer protecting them. The systematic nature of the mistreatment meant that speaking individually hadn't worked. Veterans who filed complaints were dismissed as isolated malcontents, their concerns buried in bureaucratic processes that produced form letter responses without substantive action. By the end of the meeting, 18 veterans had agreed to participate in Rebecca's investigation, sharing their stories and documentation with the understanding that their experiences would be part of a larger exposé of VA practices. Maria volunteered to serve as the primary coordinator, working with Rebecca to organize interviews and ensure that participating veterans understood both the potential benefits and risks of going public. The weeks that followed were intense and emotionally draining. Maria spent hours each day reviewing documents, coordinating interviews, and providing support to veterans who were reliving traumatic experiences as they shared their stories with Rebecca. The investigation expanded beyond Phoenix as Rebecca connected with veterans in other cities who had experienced similar treatment, revealing a national pattern of systematic abuse. The breakthrough revelation came from Dr. Castellanos, the physician who had conducted Maria's reevaluation. Rebecca had contacted him as part of her research into medical evaluation practices, and he agreed to an interview that provided crucial insight into how the system actually operated. "We're given performance metrics that have nothing to do with medical care," Dr. Castellanos explained during a recorded interview. "I'm evaluated based on how many claims I deny or reduce, not on the quality of care I provide to veterans. Doctors who approve too many claims get called in for, quote, additional training. That's really pressure to be more skeptical. He described a culture within VA medical facilities where physicians were discouraged from trusting veteran accounts of their symptoms and encouraged to look for evidence of exaggeration or malingering. New doctors received training that emphasized fraud detection over trauma-informed care, creating an adversarial relationship between veterans and the medical professionals who were supposed to be helping them heal. When I felt the shrapnel in Maria's spine, Dr. Castellanos continued, I realized how wrong our assumptions had been. Here was incontrovertible physical evidence of her injuries, but we'd required her to humiliate herself to prove what was already documented in her medical records. It made me question every other case I'd evaluated, every veteran I'd doubted. His interview provided the medical insider perspective that Rebecca needed to demonstrate how institutional pressure was corrupting clinical judgment and turning healthcare providers into advocates for denial rather than healing. Dr. Castellanos agreed to go on the record despite knowing it would likely end his career with the VA, saying he couldn't continue to participate in a system that betrayed both his medical ethics and his respect for veteran service. The investigation also uncovered financial documents showing how contractor bonuses for surveillance and denial recommendations were structured. The private firms conducting veteran surveillance received base payments for their services, but substantial bonuses for every case that resulted in reduced benefits. One company had received $800,000 in bonus payments over 18 months, representing hundreds of veterans whose benefits had been cut based on investigative reports that ignored the complex realities of living with combat injuries. Perhaps most damaging were internal communications between VA regional offices and contractor firms, emails that revealed explicit coordination to target specific categories of veterans for intensive scrutiny. Veterans with subjective conditions like PTSD and chronic pain were flagged for surveillance at much higher rates than those with obvious physical injuries, reflecting an institutional bias that treated invisible wounds as inherently suspect. The communications also revealed racial and gender disparities in evaluation processes. Female veterans were re-evaluated at rates 60% higher than their male counterparts, with evaluation reports frequently questioning whether women could have sustained combat injuries given their military roles. Veterans of color faced similar scrutiny, with investigators noting their participation in community activities as evidence that their isolation and anxiety weren't as severe as claimed. As Rebecca's investigation neared completion, Maria found herself reflecting on how dramatically her understanding of veteran services had evolved. 18 months earlier, she had viewed the challenges with her disability claim as individual problems requiring individual solutions. Now she understood that her experience was part of a systematic campaign to deny veterans the support they had earned through their service. The personal cost of coordinating the investigation had been substantial. The constant immersion in stories of injustice and betrayal had worsened Maria's own PTSD symptoms, creating anxiety and hypervigilance that made daily functioning more difficult. The time and energy required for advocacy work had left little room for the healing and recovery that she needed for her own physical and psychological wounds. But the investigation had also provided something invaluable, a sense of purpose that connected her current struggles to her military service. In Afghanistan, she had protected her fellow soldiers from external threats. Now she was protecting her fellow veterans from institutional betrayal, using different skills to fight a different kind of war. The night before Rebecca's story was scheduled to publish, Maria sat in her apartment reviewing the final draft. The article was comprehensive and devastating, presenting documented evidence of systematic efforts to deny veterans their earned benefits through surveillance, biased evaluations, and financial incentives that rewarded skepticism over care. The veterans who had agreed to be interviewed were identified by name, their stories told with dignity and respect that honored both their service and their current struggles. Maria's own experience anchored the article, her journey from individual claim denial to systematic advocacy, providing a narrative thread that connected the broader policy issues to human consequences. Reading her own words in print felt surreal. They made me strip naked to prove my pain was real, then acted surprised when they found the shrapnel in my spine. But my humiliation was just one example of how the system treats veterans, like we're guilty until proven innocent, like our service was a lie and our injuries are fraud attempts. The article would be published in the Sunday edition, with national syndication already arranged through Rebecca's news organization's partnerships. Congressional offices had been provided advance copies, and veteran advocacy organizations were preparing coordinated responses to capitalize on the public attention the story would generate. As Maria prepared for bed, she felt the familiar sensation of the shrapnel shifting in her spine, the metal fragments that had brought her into this fight in the first place. Tomorrow, those fragments would become symbols of a larger struggle, evidence not just of her individual service and sacrifice, but of the betrayal that thousands of veterans faced when they sought help for the wounds they had sustained in defense of their country. The war for veteran dignity was about to go public, and Maria Santos was ready to lead the charge. The Phoenix Tribune's expose hit the newsstands on a Sunday morning that would later be marked as a turning point in veteran advocacy. Maria's phone began ringing at 0600 hours, with calls from veterans across the country who had read the article online and wanted to share their own similar experiences. By noon, her voicemail was full, and by evening, she had received more than 200 emails from veterans, family members, and advocates who had been fighting the same battles in isolation. The immediate response was overwhelming in its scope and intensity. Veterans from every branch of service, from conflicts spanning from Vietnam to the most recent deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, came forward with stories that mirrored the systematic mistreatment documented in Rebecca's investigation. The pattern was consistent across decades and geographic regions. Disabled veterans forced to repeatedly prove their injuries were real, surveillance programs that treated them as potential criminals, and evaluation processes designed to find reasons for denial rather than provide appropriate care. Within 48 hours, 3 separate congressional offices had contacted Rebecca requesting briefings on her findings. Senator Martinez from Arizona, whose own military service had given her credibility on veteran issues, announced plans for immediate hearings on VA disability evaluation practices. The House Veterans Affairs Committee scheduled emergency sessions to review the contractor surveillance programs that had been exposed in the article. Maria found herself thrust into a role she had never sought, unofficial spokesperson for a movement that had emerged spontaneously from shared frustration and documented injustice. Veterans organizations that had previously focused on individual case advocacy began coordinating larger reform efforts, using the evidence Rebecca had compiled to demand systematic changes to evaluation policies and contractor oversight. The VA's initial response was predictably defensive. A spokesperson issued a statement emphasizing the department's commitment to preventing fraud while supporting legitimate claims, using language that suggested the exposed practices were isolated incidents rather than systematic policy. But the documented evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss, and the volume of veteran testimonials too large to ignore. Dr. Castellanos' decision to speak publicly about evaluation pressures triggered a cascade of revelations from other VA medical professionals. Within a week of the article's publication, 15 doctors and evaluators had come forward with similar accounts of institutional pressure to deny claims and question veteran credibility. Their testimonies provided crucial insider perspective on how financial incentives and performance metrics had corrupted clinical judgment. The breakthrough came when Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who had conducted hundreds of veteran evaluations over 5 years, provided Rebecca with internal training materials that explicitly instructed evaluators to approach veteran claims with skepticism. The materials included guidelines for identifying red flags that were based more on bias than medical evidence, such as veterans who maintained employment despite disability claims or who participated in family activities. "We were taught to view veteran adaptability as evidence of fraud," Dr. Walsh explained in a follow-up interview. If someone found ways to cope with their injuries and maintained some functionality, that was seen as proof they weren't as disabled as they claimed. The system punished veterans for being resilient. The training materials became the smoking gun that transformed the story from allegations of mistreatment into documented proof of institutional bias. Congressional investigators subpoenaed additional VA training records, revealing a systematic effort to reduce benefit approvals through evaluator conditioning rather than medical evidence. The political momentum built rapidly as more evidence emerged. The surveillance contractor records that Rebecca had obtained were cross-referenced with benefit decisions, revealing direct correlations between investigation reports and claim denials. Veterans who had been photographed engaging in normal daily activities, grocery shopping, attending family events, walking their dogs, were 75% more likely to have their benefits reduced regardless of their medical conditions. Maria testified before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee in a hearing room packed with disabled veterans, family members, and advocates. Sitting at the witness table under bright television lights, she felt the same focused concentration that had served her during sniper missions. The ability to block out distractions and deliver critical information with precision and clarity. "Senators, I didn't choose to become an advocate," Maria began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I became one because the system that promised to care for veterans like me treated us as enemies instead of allies. The shrapnel in my spine is real. The pain I live with every day is real. The sacrifices made by thousands of veterans are real. What's not real is the assumption that we're lying about our injuries until we can prove otherwise." Her testimony lasted 40 minutes, during which she walked the committee through the systematic nature of veteran mistreatment while avoiding partisan political language that might diminish her credibility. The questions from senators were respectful and substantive, reflecting genuine concern about the practices that had been exposed rather than political posturing. The most powerful moment came when Senator Thompson, a Vietnam veteran himself, asked Maria to explain the psychological impact of being treated as a potential fraud after serving her country. "Senator, imagine that you've given everything you have to your job, your health, your safety, your peace of mind," Maria replied. "Then imagine that when you need help because of injuries you sustained on that job, your employer treats you like a criminal who's trying to steal from them. That's what it feels like to be a disabled veteran in this system we've already sacrificed for our country. Now we're being punished for needing help with the consequences of that sacrifice." The hearing generated national media coverage that amplified the story beyond veteran advocacy circles. Major news networks picked up the story, interviewing veterans from across the country who shared experiences similar to those documented in Rebecca's original investigation. The personal stories, combined with the documentary evidence of systematic bias, created public pressure that made congressional inaction politically impossible. The first concrete victory came 6 weeks after the story's publication, when the VA announced the immediate suspension of its contractor surveillance programs, pending a comprehensive review of their effectiveness and ethical implications. The announcement came after congressional investigators revealed that the programs had cost $127 million over 3 years, while producing benefit savings that were largely achieved through denials that were later overturned on appeal. More significant was the announcement of new evaluation protocols that required medical assessments to be conducted by physicians with relevant experience treating combat injuries. The adversarial evaluation approach that had dominated VA practices for years was replaced with trauma-informed care standards that recognized the complex realities of living with service-connected disabilities. Maria worked closely with congressional staff to develop legislation that would codify these changes and provide additional protections for disabled veterans. The Veterans Dignity Act, introduced by a bipartisan coalition of senators, included provisions for independent oversight of evaluation processes, mandatory training for VA medical staff on trauma-informed care, and legal protections for veterans who reported mistreatment. The legislation also established a veteran advocate program that would provide independent representation for veterans during the evaluation process. Maria was offered the position of National Program Coordinator, a role that would allow her to ensure that the reforms she had helped create were properly implemented across the VA system. Accepting the position required Maria to move to Washington, D.C., a transition that was both exciting and daunting. The chronic pain from her spinal injuries remained a constant challenge, but the work provided a sense of purpose that helped her manage the daily difficulties of living with permanent disabilities. The apartment she found near the Capitol was small, but had the accessibility features she needed, and the salary from her new position provided the financial security that had been missing since her military discharge. The first year in Washington was intense and exhausting. Maria spent her days meeting with VA administrators, congressional staff, and veteran advocates to develop implementation plans for the new evaluation protocols. The resistance from entrenched bureaucracies was substantial. Many VA regional offices had built their operations around the assumption that veteran claims should be viewed with suspicion, and changing the culture required constant pressure and oversight. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But progress was measurable and meaningful. Approval rates for initial disability claims increased by 28% in the first year following implementation of the new protocols. More importantly, veteran satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in how they were treated during the evaluation process. Veterans reported feeling heard, respected and supported rather than questioned and doubted. The surveillance programs that had caused so much trauma were formally discontinued, with the $127 million budget redirected toward expanding mental health services and improving access to specialized medical care for veterans with combat injuries. The private investigation firms that had built their business models around veteran surveillance were forced to find new markets, while the VA developed internal quality assurance programs that focused on ensuring appropriate care rather than detecting fraud. Dr. Castellanos became the poster child for the cultural transformation within VA medical services. His willingness to speak publicly about institutional pressure had cost him his job, but it had also made him a symbol of medical professionals who prioritized patient care over bureaucratic compliance. He was hired as the lead trainer for the new trauma-informed evaluation protocols, developing curricula that taught VA physicians to approach veteran claims with appropriate clinical skepticism while avoiding the adversarial assumptions that had characterized previous training. The impact extended beyond policy changes to the personal lives of veterans who had been caught in the old system. Marcus received a formal apology from the VA, along with restoration of his full disability benefits, acknowledging that the re-evaluation of his case had been conducted under flawed protocols that failed to recognize the permanent nature of his injuries. Robert Chen's PTSD benefits were not only restored, but increased to reflect the additional trauma he had experienced during 45 years of fighting for recognition of his service-connected condition. Linda Morrison became one of the most powerful advocates for the new system, sharing her story at congressional hearings and veteran events across the country. Her experience of being forced to repeatedly relive her trauma for skeptical evaluators resonated with thousands of veterans who had endured similar treatment. The restoration of her benefits allowed her to focus on healing rather than survival, and she eventually became a peer counselor helping other veterans navigate the reformed evaluation process. The Phoenix support group that had served as the launching pad for the larger reform movement evolved into a model program that was replicated in VA facilities across the country. Dr. Martinez worked with national veteran organizations to develop standardized curricula for peer support groups, incorporating lessons learned from the advocacy campaign about the importance of collective action and mutual support. Maria's personal transformation paralleled the systematic changes she had helped create. The chronic pain from her spinal injuries remained a daily reality, but it no longer defined the limits of her life. The work she was doing provided meaning that transcended her physical limitations, connecting her current struggles to her military service in ways that honored both her sacrifice and her resilience. The relationship between her pain and her purpose became clearer over time. The shrapnel embedded in her spine wasn't just a medical condition requiring management, it was tangible evidence of the cost of service, a reminder of what veterans risked when they answered their country's call. Her daily experience of living with those fragments gave her credibility and motivation that policymakers without military experience couldn't match. 2 years after the Phoenix Tribune exposé, Maria was invited to speak at the annual conference of the Disabled American Veterans Organization. Standing before an audience of 3,000 veterans, many of whom bore visible and invisible wounds from their service, she reflected on how far the reform movement had come and how much work remained to be done. 3 years ago, I was forced to strip naked to prove that my pain was real, she told the audience, her voice carrying across the convention center without amplification. Today, veterans facing evaluation know they will be treated with dignity and respect. That's not the end of our fight. It's the foundation we build on as we continue working for the care and support that all veterans have earned. The speech was interrupted 17 times by standing ovations, with veterans recognizing not just Maria's individual advocacy, but the collective victory that her work had helped achieve. The transformation from victim to advocate to policy architect represented a journey that thousands of veterans had taken in different ways, using their experiences of mistreatment as motivation for systematic change. The legislative victories continued to accumulate. The Veterans Dignity Act was signed into law with bipartisan support, providing legal framework for the evaluation reforms that Maria had helped develop. Additional legislation expanded access to specialized medical care for veterans with chronic pain, increased funding for research into combat-related injuries, and established stricter oversight of contractor relationships that had previously allowed exploitation of veteran vulnerability. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than legislative. The assumption that veteran disability claims should be met with suspicion had been replaced by recognition that service-connected injuries deserved prompt, respectful attention from medical professionals trained to understand combat trauma. The adversarial relationship between veterans and the VA was slowly giving way to a collaborative approach focused on healing and support. The financial benefits of the reforms extended beyond individual veterans to the broader healthcare system. When veterans received appropriate care for their service-connected injuries early in the process, they were less likely to develop secondary conditions that required expensive emergency treatment. The cost savings from improved preventative care more than offset the increased spending on disability benefits, demonstrating that treating veterans with dignity was not only morally right, but financially sound. Maria's role as national coordinator of the Veteran Advocate Program required constant travel to VA facilities across the country, implementing training programs and monitoring compliance with new evaluation protocols. The physical demands of the job were challenging given her spinal injuries, but accommodations were built into the position that allowed her to work effectively within her limitations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now working for the same VA system that had initially doubted her injuries and questioned her integrity. But the transformation she witnessed during facility visits convinced her that systematic change was possible when institutions were held accountable for their treatment of the people they served. During a visit to the Seattle VA Medical Center, Maria met Sarah Kim, a Marine veteran whose experience paralleled her own journey 3 years earlier. Sarah had been injured by an IED during her deployment to Iraq, sustaining traumatic brain injury and chronic pain that had ended her military career. Unlike Maria's experience, Sarah's evaluation had been conducted under the new protocols, with medical professionals who understood combat injuries and evaluation processes designed to support rather than scrutinize. "They believed me from the beginning," Sarah told Maria during their meeting. "The doctor explained every step of the evaluation, answered all my questions, and made sure I understood my rights. I felt like they were trying to help me rather than catch me in a lie." Sarah's experience represented the new standard that Maria and her fellow advocates had fought to establish. Veterans no longer had to prove their worth or defend their pain. They were treated as trusted sources of information about their own conditions, with medical evaluations focused on determining appropriate care rather than detecting fraud. The conversation with Sarah reminded Maria of how far the system had evolved, but also of how many veterans had been failed by the old approach. For every Sarah who benefited from reformed evaluation protocols, there were hundreds of veterans who had been damaged by years of suspicion, surveillance, and systematic doubt about their service-connected injuries. This recognition led Maria to establish the Veterans Justice Project, a nonprofit organization focused on helping veterans who had been wrongfully denied benefits under the previous system. The project provided legal representation for appeals cases, connected veterans with medical professionals who understood combat injuries, and advocated for retroactive benefit payments to veterans who had been harmed by flawed evaluation processes. The project's first major victory came when they successfully appealed the case of William Torres, a Vietnam veteran who had been denied PTSD benefits for 35 years based on evaluation processes that ignored the unique characteristics of combat trauma. The retroactive payment of $340,000 represented not just financial compensation but formal acknowledgement that the system had failed him for more than 3 decades. The Veterans Justice Project expanded rapidly as word spread throughout the veteran community about its success in overturning wrongful denials. Within 18 months, the organization had opened offices in 12 cities and employed 40 staff members, including veterans, attorneys, and medical professionals who specialized in service-connected injuries. Maria's leadership of the project required her to develop skills that went far beyond her military training and advocacy experience. She learned grant writing to secure funding from foundations and individual donors who supported veteran causes. She mastered media relations to ensure that the project's work received public attention that translated into political support for continued reforms. Most importantly, she learned to balance the emotional demands of constantly hearing stories of veteran mistreatment with the need to maintain her own physical and psychological health. The chronic pain from her spinal injuries required ongoing management, and the stress of advocacy work could exacerbate both her physical symptoms and the PTSD that had developed following her combat experiences. The solution came through peer support networks that connected her with other veterans who had successfully transitioned from personal struggle to advocacy leadership. These relationships provided both practical advice about managing chronic conditions while maintaining demanding careers and emotional support from people who understood the unique challenges of veteran advocacy work. 5 years after the Phoenix Tribune exposé, Maria was invited to speak at the dedication of the Veterans Dignity Memorial in Washington, D.C. The memorial honored veterans who had died while fighting for recognition of their service-connected injuries, including several from her original support group who had not lived to see the reforms they had helped inspire. Standing before the memorial's bronze plaques that listed the names of veterans who had been failed by the system they had served, Maria felt the weight of representation that came with surviving long enough to help create change. Her individual journey from disabled veteran to national advocate had become part of a larger story about institutional accountability and the power of collective action. The memorial dedication drew thousands of veterans, family members, and advocates who had participated in the reform movement. The crowd included many faces that Maria recognized from congressional hearings, support groups, and media interviews. People who had shared their stories publicly, despite the risks to their own benefits and privacy. The keynote address was delivered by Dr. Martinez, who had left her clinical practice to become the VA's National Director of Veteran-Centered Care. Her speech focused on the cultural transformation that had occurred within VA medical services, acknowledging the institutional failures that had necessitated reform, while celebrating the progress that had been achieved through sustained advocacy and oversight. 5 years ago, veterans were expected to prove their pain to skeptical bureaucrats, Dr. Martinez told the crowd. Today, our medical professionals are trained to recognize trauma, understand resilience, and provide care that honors both service and sacrifice. This memorial reminds us that change came too late for some, but not too late for the thousands of veterans who will benefit from the dignity and respect that should have been their right from the beginning. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Maria remained at the memorial for several minutes, reading the names of veterans who had died while fighting battles that should never have been necessary. Among them was Harold Mitchell, a Korean War veteran from her original support group who had suffered a heart attack during a particularly stressful re-evaluation process. His widow had donated his case files to the Veterans Justice Project, providing documentation that helped overturn similar denials for dozens of other veterans. The evening following the memorial dedication, Maria attended a reception for veteran advocates at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. The event brought together people who had played various roles in the reform movement: journalists, congressional staff, medical professionals, and veterans who had shared their stories publicly despite personal costs. Rebecca Torres, whose investigative reporting had launched the public phase of the reform movement, approached Maria near the museum's display of military artifacts. "I've been thinking about doing a follow-up story," Rebecca said, 5 years later, looking at what's changed and what still needs work. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with Maria providing perspective on both the victories that had been achieved and the challenges that remained. The evaluation reforms had addressed the most egregious forms of systematic bias, but individual cases of mistreatment still occurred. The cultural change within VA medical services was real but incomplete, requiring constant vigilance to prevent regression to previous practices. The biggest change isn't in the policies, Maria reflected. It's in expectations. Veterans now expect to be treated with dignity, and VA staff know they're being watched to ensure that happens. That cultural shift is harder to reverse than policy changes because it's based on relationships and accountability rather than just regulations. Rebecca's follow-up story, published exactly 5 years after her original exposé, documented the measurable improvements in veteran care while acknowledging the ongoing work required to maintain momentum for reform. The article featured interviews with veterans who had been helped by the new evaluation protocols, medical professionals who had embraced trauma-informed care approaches, and advocates who continued working to address remaining gaps in veteran services. The story also included an update on Maria's personal journey, describing how her transformation from struggling disabled veteran to national advocate had been enabled by the same systematic changes she had helped create. The chronic pain from her spinal injuries remained a daily reality, but it no longer limited her ability to contribute meaningfully to causes she cared about. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Maria's office in the Veterans Justice Project headquarters, casting long shadows across the case files that covered her desk. At 38, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to accommodate chronic pain while refusing to be defined by it. The shrapnel fragments in her spine remained exactly where they had lodged 8 years earlier, but they no longer felt like foreign invaders in her body. They had become part of her identity, tangible reminders of both her service and her resilience. The office walls displayed photographs that told the story of the reform movement, veterans testifying before Congress, medical professionals receiving training in trauma-informed care, and celebration events marking legislative victories. The largest photograph showed the crowd at the Veterans Dignity Memorial dedication, thousands of people who had participated in transforming how America cared for its disabled veterans. Maria's assistant knocked on the doorframe, carrying the morning briefing folder that summarized new cases, policy developments, and media coverage related to veteran advocacy. "The Wilson case files came in from Seattle," she said, setting down a thick folder. "Wrongful denial spanning 12 years, similar pattern to the Torres case we won last year." The Wilson case represented exactly the kind of systematic injustice that the Veterans Justice Project had been created to address. Thomas Wilson, an Army veteran with combat-related PTSD and chronic pain, had been denied benefits for more than a decade based on evaluation processes that ignored medical evidence in favor of behavioral observations. His case had been flagged for review after advocates identified patterns of bias in the evaluation reports that had been used to justify denial of his claims. Maria opened the folder and began reviewing the documentation, her trained eye quickly identifying the telltale signs of flawed evaluation processes. The medical records clearly documented Wilson's combat injuries and their ongoing impact on his daily functioning, but the evaluation reports focused on isolated observations of him engaging in normal activities, shopping for groceries, attending his son's graduation, participating in family gatherings. The pattern was familiar from hundreds of similar cases that had come through the Veterans Justice Project over the past 5 years. Veterans were expected to perform their disabilities consistently, to demonstrate pain and limitation in ways that satisfied evaluators who had been trained to look for evidence of exaggeration rather than signs of adaptation and resilience. What made the Wilson case particularly significant was its timing. The evaluation that had resulted in denial of his benefits had been conducted 6 months after the implementation of reformed protocols that were supposed to eliminate exactly this kind of biased assessment. The case suggested that despite systematic changes, individual evaluators and regional offices were still operating under assumptions that veterans were likely to be lying about their injuries. Maria dictated a memo to her legal team outlining the approach for Wilson's appeal, emphasizing the need to document not just the individual injustice, but the broader pattern of non-compliance with reformed evaluation standards. Each successful case helped reinforce the cultural changes that had been achieved while providing precedent for future appeals. The phone rang with a call from Dr. Castellanos, who had become both a professional colleague and personal friend during the years since his testimony about evaluation pressures had helped catalyze systematic reform. He was calling from his office at the VA Training Center, where he now developed curricula for medical professionals learning to conduct trauma-informed evaluations. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something we're seeing in the field," Dr. Castellanos said, his voice carrying the concern that had become characteristic of his advocacy work. "Some regional offices are finding ways around the new protocols. They're not conducting biased evaluations, but they're creating administrative barriers that make it harder for veterans to access the evaluation process in the first place." The conversation that followed illustrated both the progress that had been achieved and the vigilance required to maintain it. Bureaucratic systems had tremendous capacity to adapt to reforms in ways that preserved their essential character while appearing to comply with new requirements. Veterans were no longer being treated with overt suspicion during evaluations, but some were finding it nearly impossible to schedule evaluations in the first place. "We need to document this systematically," Maria said, making notes as they talked. "If they're creating access barriers, we need to treat that as a violation of the evaluation reforms. The right to dignified treatment doesn't mean much if veterans can't access the system at all." The call concluded with plans for a joint investigation into regional office practices, combining Dr. Castellanos' access to internal VA operations with the Veterans Justice Project's documentation of veteran experiences. The collaboration represented the kind of ongoing oversight that had proven essential for maintaining reform momentum over time. Maria's next appointment was with Sarah Kim, the Marine veteran she had met 3 years earlier at the Seattle VA Medical Center. Sarah had successfully transitioned from military service to civilian career with the support of properly processed disability benefits, and she was now volunteering with the Veterans Justice Project to help other veterans navigate the system that had treated her with dignity and respect. "I've been thinking about what you said about using our experiences to help others," Sarah said as they sat in Maria's office. "I want to do more than just volunteer. I want to make this my career." The conversation that followed explored Sarah's interest in becoming a veteran advocate professionally, potentially pursuing legal training that would allow her to represent veterans in appeals cases. Her experience with the reformed evaluation system gave her credibility with veterans who were still struggling with wrongful denials, while her military background provided common ground that facilitated trust and communication. "The most important thing is that you understand this work will be emotionally demanding," Maria explained. "Every case we take involves a veteran who has been failed by the system they served. Some days, hearing those stories back to back becomes overwhelming." Sarah nodded, her expression serious but determined. "I understand the cost. But I also understand what it means to be treated with dignity by people who are supposed to help you. If I can help other veterans have that experience instead of what you went through, it's worth the emotional toll." The mentorship relationship that developed over the following months reflected the generational aspect of veteran advocacy work. Veterans who had benefited from reformed policies were becoming advocates for those who remained trapped by legacy denials and ongoing bias. The movement was becoming self-sustaining, with each victory creating new advocates who understood both the problems and the solutions from personal experience. 5 years later, the 10th anniversary symposium of the Veterans Dignity Act was held in the same Senate hearing room where Maria had first testified about systematic mistreatment of disabled veterans. The room was packed with veterans, advocates, medical professionals, and policymakers who had participated in the reform movement over the past decade. Senator Martinez, now the chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee, delivered opening remarks that summarized the measurable changes that had occurred since the Phoenix Tribune expose had first revealed the scope of systematic bias within veteran evaluation processes. Approval rates for disability claims had stabilized at levels that reflected medical evidence rather than administrative quotas. Veteran satisfaction with evaluation processes had increased by more than 400%. Most significantly, the number of veterans who died while fighting for recognition of their service-connected injuries had dropped to near zero. 10 years ago, we learned that the system designed to care for our veterans was instead treating them as potential criminals, Senator Martinez told the audience. Today, we have a system that recognizes service, honors sacrifice, and provides the care that veterans have earned through their commitment to our country. Maria was invited to deliver the keynote address, reflecting on the journey from individual struggle to systematic change that had defined the past decade. Standing at the podium where she had first shared her story with congressional investigators, she looked out at an audience that included many faces she recognized from support groups, legislative battles, and media interviews. 11 years ago, I was forced to strip naked to prove that the shrapnel in my spine was real, she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of advocacy experience. That humiliation became the foundation for a movement that transformed how America treats its disabled veterans. The fragments of metal in my back are still there, still causing daily pain, but they no longer represent evidence that had to be proven to skeptical bureaucrats. They represent service that is honored, sacrifice that is recognized, and resilience that is respected. The speech traced the evolution of veteran advocacy from individual complaints to collective action to legislative reform to cultural transformation. Each phase had built on the previous one, creating momentum that had sustained the movement through political changes, bureaucratic resistance, and the inevitable challenges of implementing systematic reform. The most important lesson we learned is that individual cases of mistreatment weren't aberrations, they were features of a system designed to doubt rather than support, Maria continued. Changing that system required more than fixing policies. It required changing assumptions, transforming culture, and creating accountability mechanisms that ensured reforms would be maintained over time. The anniversary symposium also featured panel discussions with veterans who had been helped by the reformed system, medical professionals who had embraced trauma-informed evaluation approaches, and policymakers who had championed legislative changes. The conversations illustrated how comprehensive the transformation had been, affecting not just evaluation processes but the broader relationship between veterans and the institutions that served them. Dr. Martinez, now serving as the VA's chief medical officer, participated in a panel about cultural change within VA medical services. Her presentation included data showing how training reforms had affected medical professional attitudes toward veteran claims, with surveys indicating that physicians now approached evaluations with appropriate clinical skepticism rather than assumptions of fraud. "The biggest change isn't in our procedures, it's in our mindset," Dr. Martinez explained. "We've moved from a model that assumed veterans were lying until proven otherwise to one that recognizes trauma, honors service, and focuses on providing appropriate care. That cultural shift has been more important than any specific policy reform." Rebecca Torres, whose investigative reporting had launched the public phase of the reform movement, delivered remarks about the role of media oversight in maintaining systematic change. Her follow-up reporting over the past decade had documented both successes and ongoing challenges, providing accountability that helped prevent regression to previous practices. "The story didn't end with the initial exposé," Rebecca told the audience. "Systematic change requires sustained attention, ongoing investigation, and constant pressure to ensure that reforms are implemented rather than just announced. The veterans who shared their stories publicly took real risks to create the political momentum that made change possible." The symposium concluded with the announcement of new initiatives designed to address remaining gaps in veteran services. The Veterans Justice Project was expanding its scope to include employment discrimination cases, recognizing that workplace bias against disabled veterans remained a significant barrier to successful civilian transitions. Additional legislation was being developed to extend evaluation reforms to veteran family members, acknowledging that military service affected entire families rather than just individual service members. 10 years later, Maria celebrated her 50th birthday at a gathering that brought together veterans, advocates, and friends who had become family during 2 decades of advocacy work. The party was held at the Veterans Justice Project's new national headquarters, a building that housed legal services, medical consultations, and peer support programs for veterans dealing with service-connected injuries. The physical toll of chronic pain had accumulated over the years, requiring Maria to use mobility aids and adapt her work responsibilities to accommodate increasing limitations. But the sense of purpose that came from her advocacy work had sustained her through the most difficult periods, providing meaning that transcended physical limitations. The Veterans Justice Project had grown into a national organization with offices in 34 cities, serving more than 10,000 veterans annually through legal representation, medical advocacy, and peer support programs. The organization's success rate in appeals cases exceeded 85%, with most victories resulting from documentation of evaluation processes that failed to meet reform standards rather than disputes about medical evidence. Sarah Kim, now the organization's executive director, delivered remarks at the birthday celebration that reflected on Maria's impact on veteran advocacy and the broader transformation of veteran services that her work had helped create. "Maria taught us that individual stories of injustice could become catalysts for systematic change," Sarah said. "More importantly, she showed us that veterans who had been failed by the system could become the leaders who fixed it." The celebration included testimonials from veterans whose cases had been resolved through the Veterans Justice Project's advocacy, medical professionals who had participated in evaluation reform training, and policymakers who had championed legislation inspired by Maria's original testimony. The common theme was recognition that systematic change required sustained effort from people who understood problems from personal experience and were committed to ensuring that solutions actually worked. Marcus, now in his 70s but still actively involved in veteran advocacy, spoke about the evolution of the reform movement from reactive complaints to proactive policy development. 20 years ago, we were fighting individual battles against a system that treated us like enemies, he said. Today, we're partners in designing and implementing policies that honor service and support recovery. The evening's final speaker was Dr. Castellanos, whose decision to break institutional silence about evaluation pressures had cost him one career but launched another focused on reforming medical education and veteran care. His remarks focused on the cultural transformation within medical services that had occurred over the past 2 decades. "When I first examined Maria, I was trained to look for evidence that she might be lying about her injuries," Dr. Castellanos reflected. "Today, medical students learn to recognize trauma, understand resilience, and provide care that honors both service and sacrifice." That change in education means future generations of veterans will be treated with dignity from the beginning rather than having to fight for respect after they've been injured. 15 years later, the 25th anniversary of the Phoenix Tribune Exposé was marked by the dedication of the Maria Santos Center for Veteran Advocacy at the University of Arizona. The center would house academic programs in veteran services, conduct research on military to civilian transitions, and provide clinical training for medical professionals specializing in combat-related injuries. Maria, now 55 and using a wheelchair for mobility due to progressive spinal complications, delivered the dedication address to an audience that included hundreds of veterans, students, and faculty members. Her voice remained strong despite physical limitations, carrying the authority that came from decades of advocacy experience and documented impact. This center represents more than recognition of individual advocacy, she told the audience. It represents institutional commitment to understanding veteran experiences, training professionals who will serve future generations of veterans, and conducting research that improves care for service-connected injuries. The center's establishment reflected the long-term impact of the reform movement that Maria had helped lead. Academic institutions were now incorporating veteran services into their curricula, training students in fields ranging from medicine to social work to law with specialized knowledge about military service and its consequences. The assumption that veteran issues were niche concerns had been replaced by recognition that serving veterans effectively required specific expertise and institutional commitment. The dedication ceremony also announced the establishment of the Veterans Dignity Scholarship Program, providing full financial support for veterans pursuing degrees in fields related to veteran services. The scholarships were funded through a combination of government allocations and private donations from individuals and organizations that had supported the reform movement over the past quarter-century. Sarah Kim, now a nationally recognized expert on veteran advocacy, served as the center's first director. Her vision included developing research programs that would anticipate future challenges facing veterans, rather than simply responding to existing problems. Maria's generation fought to reform a system that was failing veterans, Sarah explained. Our generation has the opportunity to design systems that honor service from the beginning. The center's research priorities reflected lessons learned from decades of advocacy work. Studies would examine the long-term impact of different evaluation approaches on veteran health outcomes. Training programs would prepare medical professionals to recognize and treat emerging categories of service-connected injuries. Policy analysis would identify potential problems before they became systematic barriers to veteran care. 20 years later, the 40th anniversary of Maria's military discharge was marked by a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, where she was honored for her service both as a soldier and as an advocate. The event drew veterans from every branch of military service, representing conflicts spanning from Vietnam to the most recent deployments in global counterterrorism operations. The ceremony took place near the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, with Maria reflecting on the evolution from her individual struggle with disability claims to the systematic changes that had transformed veteran services over 4 decades. The chronic pain that had defined so much of her adult life remained present, but it no longer represented evidence that needed to be proven to skeptical bureaucrats. It was recognized as the cost of service that had earned her the respect and support of a grateful nation. 45 years ago, I raised my right hand and swore to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, Maria said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. I never imagined that some of those enemies would be embedded in the very institutions designed to care for veterans, but I also never imagined that veterans working together could transform those institutions into partners in healing, rather than obstacles to recovery. The speech was Maria's final major public address, delivered from her wheelchair with the assistance of voice amplification technology that accommodated the respiratory complications that had developed as secondary conditions related to her spinal injuries. Despite physical limitations, her words carried the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for systematic change. The Arlington ceremony was followed by the release of Maria's memoir, Fragments of Honor from Combat to Advocacy, which documented her journey from small-town recruit to decorated sniper to disabled veteran to national advocate. The book became a bestseller within veteran communities and was adopted as required reading in academic programs focused on veteran services. The memoir's final chapter reflected on the legacy of the reform movement and the ongoing work required to maintain progress. The shrapnel in my spine will be there until the day I die, Maria wrote. But those fragments no longer represent foreign objects in my body. They represent evidence of service that is honored, sacrifice that is recognized, and resilience that is respected. More importantly, they represent the foundation for a movement that ensured future generations of veterans would be treated with dignity from the moment they needed help. 25 years later, Maria Santos died peacefully at the age of 72, surrounded by family and friends who had become an extended veteran advocacy community over the decades. Her death was marked by memorial services in Phoenix, Washington, D.C., and dozens of other cities where she had worked to improve veteran services. The Veterans Justice Project, now serving more than 50,000 veterans annually through a network of offices across all 50 states, established the Maria Santos Memorial Fund to provide emergency financial assistance to veterans facing immediate crises while fighting for recognition of their service-connected injuries. The fund reflected Maria's understanding that systematic change took time, but individual veterans needed help immediately. Sarah Kim, delivering the eulogy at the memorial service in Phoenix, spoke about Maria's transformation from isolated struggle to collective action to institutional change. Maria taught us that individual pain could become collective power when veterans work together rather than fighting alone, Sarah said. More importantly, she showed us that systematic change was possible when people who understood problems from personal experience were willing to dedicate their lives to creating solutions. The memorial service was attended by hundreds of veterans whose cases had been resolved through advocacy work that Maria had initiated or inspired. Their presence represented the living legacy of her work. Veterans who had been able to rebuild their lives because the system that was supposed to help them had been reformed to actually provide support rather than create additional obstacles. Dr. Castellanos, now retired but still actively involved in medical education reform, spoke about the cultural transformation within veteran medical services that had resulted from Maria's advocacy. When Maria first entered my examination room, I was trained to doubt her story, he reflected. Today, medical students learn to honor service, recognize trauma, and provide care that supports healing rather than additional injury. That change in medical education means Maria's impact will continue for generations of veterans who will receive appropriate care from the beginning. The service concluded with the reading of letters from veterans across the country who had been helped by the systematic changes that Maria's advocacy had created. The letters represented thousands of individual stories of veterans who had been treated with dignity, received appropriate medical care, and successfully transitioned to civilian life because the system designed to serve them actually worked as intended. The final letter was from a young Marine veteran named David Rodriguez who had been medically discharged after losing his leg in an IED explosion during a deployment to Syria. His evaluation for disability benefits had been conducted under protocols that Maria had helped develop, with medical professionals trained in trauma-informed care approaches. I never met Maria Santos, but her work saved my life, Rodriguez wrote. When I needed help after my injury, the system treated me with respect from the beginning. I didn't have to prove my pain was real or defend my service record to skeptical bureaucrats. The people who evaluated my case understood military service and focused on providing appropriate care rather than looking for reasons to deny my claim. I was able to start rebuilding my life immediately rather than spending years fighting for recognition of my injuries. The letter concluded with words that captured the essential impact of Maria's life work. The shrapnel in her spine became the foundation for a movement that ensured veterans like me would be honored rather than humiliated when we needed help. Her individual pain became collective healing for thousands of veterans who benefited from the systematic changes she helped create. As the memorial service ended and attendees began to leave, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Phoenix landscape that had been home to Maria's transformation from struggling disabled veteran to national advocate. The mountains in the distance remained unchanged, but the institutions and assumptions that had once treated veterans as potential criminals had been fundamentally altered by the work of people who understood injustice from personal experience and refused to accept it as inevitable. The Veterans Justice Project continued its work under new leadership, but with mission and methods that reflected Maria's understanding that systematic change required sustained effort from people who had been personally affected by the problems they sought to solve. Her office remained exactly as she had left it, with photographs documenting decades of advocacy work and case files representing veterans whose lives had been improved through collective action and institutional reform. The final entry in Maria's personal journal, written 3 days before her death, summarized the philosophy that had guided her advocacy work for more than 3 decades. The fragments of metal in my spine taught me that individual wounds could become collective strength when people shared their pain rather than suffering alone. My greatest hope is that veterans of future conflicts will be treated with dignity from the moment they need help, rather than having to fight for respect after they've already sacrificed for their country. The words served as both epitaph and mission statement for the movement that had grown from her individual struggle into institutional transformation that honored service and supported healing for generations of American veterans. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.